Hello and welcome to my podcast. And I would like to welcome a special guest today, Tom Miller. How are you today?
Good. Good to see you, Alon. Thank you.
Great. So before we dive in, really what I want to talk about today is what I call cutting through the noise, which is really a series of few episodes. This being the first one, probably the most important one in the series, because this is where we lay the foundation of what does it mean, why we see what we see in the cybersecurity industry, and what are some of the things that can be implemented to tackle those. But before we dive in, Tom, if you don't mind, maybe share a little bit about yourself so our audience will know who you are.
Yeah, thanks. So Alon and I met, we'll start there, at Trend Micro, a cybersecurity company. We had a very good run there. I was at Trend Micro in a variety of executive roles for 10 years. And the vast majority of my career has been in go-to-market. So a long time as a frontline salesperson, sales executive, marketing executive, and GM, which was very interesting suddenly as a sales and marketing guy to have 500 engineers reporting into you. So a strong need to study the implications of strategy, value, innovation, and then try to predict where the market was going. So for me, a lot of this came together through those experiences. And, at the end of the day, it's still all about creating an environment that rewards innovation. And my focus, whether as an operator or just in helping a company try to maximize the value of their innovation, was to focus on these ideas about what can we do to create an environment that maximizes the chance that we'll hit our objectives. And then very much to the point of this podcast, the problem we all face is, especially in the cybersecurity field, there are over 4,000 cybersecurity companies. My guess, you might have a different opinion. Maybe the world needs 50 or 100, but there are thousands. And so it really does beg the question, how do we cut through the noise and make our offer or solution stand out and maximize the chance that a value exchange event will occur that we can bring to scale? And that's really been my focus for the last few years.
And I think something else that is worth mentioning, I just read your book, Call Your Shots, which is really a very pragmatic framework to tackle some of these challenges. And we're going to go through that throughout this episode and break it down. But do you want to maybe share a little bit about what made you want to spend time, being a pragmatic executive to now an author and a book writer?
Well, I can tell you this, a funny story. I saw an author interviewed, and the interviewer said, "Do you enjoy writing?" And the person paused with this anguished look, and after a few moments said, "I enjoy having written." And I can attest to that. No, I do not recommend trying to write a book. It's sort of, really an endeavor that takes all of your energy and focus. And I had to trick myself into techniques that would allow me to try to get some words on the page every day. And the truth is, I didn't want to write a book. I literally just wanted to read the book that explained this question that was driving me crazy. Why is winning so rare that when it happens, they call you a unicorn? Why is failure the norm and success this sort of the metaphor of a mythical creature, sort of teasing us to believe that all these conditions have to exist at these exact moments in time, and otherwise you will not be among these anointed few that get to enjoy the pinnacle of success. And I, as the person at the front line of all of these endeavors, I thought, well, there has to be a sort of less esoteric reality. Like, what really explains which companies win and get rewarded for their innovation at the highest level, And then what separates those companies, those few, like in cybersecurity, 20,000 cybersecurity companies got started in the last 20 years, but only 20 went public. 20,000 got started, 20 went public. What separated the 20 from the other 19,980? And that was the question that I felt I needed the answer for. So I embarked really on this journey of exploring the science of the relationship between innovation and value, and then the human need to process and exchange a value event, and ultimately make a decision that would reward the winner. And there's an old expression in sales, and this: second place is the first loser. And really punish everyone that's not in a leadership or at least close second position. So that became the essence of the book. And I don't know that I discovered anything that you would consider to be radical in any way. It's just the connective tissue between these ideas was really my own innovation, was a way to theorize these concepts between innovation and value perception, and the way to package value to cut through the noise and maximize the chance that you can condition the marketplace to reward you with a scalable value exchange. Sort of, in sales, we're always trying to be highly performing and highly predictable. And so, the concept that I've referred to often is that, can we really build a revenue delivery platform? Another way, I think, if you think about it in broader terms, is, can we think of success as a planned event? You can pretty much buy anything as a service these days, but why can't you buy success as a service? I wanted to read the book that explained how to acquire success, and to apply it through a framework that you could repeat at scale and do it systematically. And that ultimately was the thesis. And I've implemented the framework now a few times as an operator. I can attest to the fact that that I don't know of another framework that gives any enterprise a better chance to maximize the likelihood of success than this framework. If there's a better one, I'll gladly drop mine and use the new one. But at the moment, this is what works, and really, those are the reasons I wrote the book.
Right. So this is a great segue to maybe double click and go a little bit deeper. So I think that there is a somewhat of a consensus that there's way too many vendors in the cybersecurity industry. I just came back a few weeks ago from Black Hat, and I couldn't say that there was one message that resonated more than another. And frankly, multiple vendors sounded exactly the same. And that's part of the problem that I think that both vendors, companies, sales teams are struggling with, C-suite teams, as well as a CISO, as well as a buyer stepping into that basically cage and basically getting attacked from 20,000 different directions. And it's not clear which one is the one that is truly different or has real value or perceived value. We'll talk about that shortly. So, how do we cut through the noise is really the next question. And if we can talk about the framework that you describe in your book, Call Your Shots, and what I liked about that is you decided to use a law of nature, so that's gravity, proximity, and mass, to describe the problem, and then how to build a framework and to go through a process, a structured process to start to tackle those challenges. So can you talk about that and double click into the framework itself?
Yeah, and really, what you're referencing, it was the backdrop to these nagging sets of questions that as operators we all face. How do I cut through the noise? How do I put my best foot forward? How do I communicate at scale to the marketplace? And how do I differentiate myself? And we've all chased the same techniques for many years. And, we can think about, the idea of features and benefits. I think, the world evolved from features and benefits, largely referred to as need selling, to solution selling. And then a couple of years ago, Harvard Business School announced that solution selling was dead. It's like, oh, great, I've devoted my whole life to solution selling. Now that's dead. And insight selling is now what is demanded. And what is an insight, if you think about it? It's this aha moment. I tried to do the math one day, at least 25,000 sales calls in my career, probably many more. And the most common question I get was the buyer invariably saying, look, put away the PowerPoint presentation, just tell me the one thing. Like, we've all heard the expression, what's your secret sauce? What makes you special? What's your uniqueness? And in my research, what I discovered is that humans process the idea of whether a value exchange event, and this is a very important concept, will ultimately be worth it. They process it through the lens of this, what I was taught, it was as the value triangle. And value is perceived by human beings as a combination of economic elements, functional elements, and emotional elements. The problem is, it's not a triangle. It's actually one long line where the vast majority of your value lives. And so the essence of creating high perceived value is to start with this thing I call the inner core. Now, if you start imagining, well, what's the measure for a unit of value? Look it up. There is no unit of value that humans use to equate the worthiness of something and then answer the question of whether or not something is worthy, because all we'll do is apply the worthiness factor to the idea of the price of something. But the price largely just allows the calculus to occur and the balancing to occur between these other ways that humans are actually perceiving value, which is the long tent in the pole is occupying about 70% of all perceived value. So start with that. So what's my offer? What is its value type? Am I in market because I built a better mousetrap and I have high functional utility? Well, if your value type is functional, identify the single thing that you're the best at functionally, and then bias the way you communicate to the marketplace on that single access. That accounts for as much as 70% of all perceived value. Ultimately, you're going to have to bring into balance the idea that an exchange of value is worth it. So you will ultimately have to make statements about the worthiness of your offer. And so this economic value balancing perception probably accounts at the end for somewhere in the neighborhood of, depending on the offer, between 5 and 25% of perceived value. And then if you think that the full pie means if 70% is in my primary value type and maybe 15 or 25% is in this idea that the offer ultimately has to be perceived as worth it or no exchange of value event will occur, then the remaining value element, and for technology companies, often we compete on a functional access, and then we try to convince the customer that it's worth it because compared to all alternatives, if you exchange value, you will feel a certain way. And that ultimately completes the part of the framework, which I call the 3R test. You have to rationalize functional promises of impact. You have to resolve the need for the customer to feel that an exchange of value is ultimately going to be worth it, and you have to reinforce worthiness. So rationalize, okay, then and then reaffirm the emotional component of your offer, and then reinforce its value, which we would largely think of as negotiation. And literally, that's what's happening during most negotiations. You're making additional attempts to rationalize your functional promises of impact. You constantly are reaffirming. Like I say to salespeople, when I train salespeople, don't ever ask a prospect what they think. Alon, you've heard about my offer. What do you think? That's the wrong question. Alon, you've heard about my offer. How do you feel? And if they tell you they're not feeling it, it means you failed the first R. You did not effectively rationalize your promise of impact. So go back. Now, the framework in the book, it lays all this out in a kind of a really systematic, repeatable approach. I mean, for me, I was not trying to write a storytelling book. I was trying to write more of an owner's manual that instructed people to understand how to flow through the complete process from, I sometimes refer to it as all the way from innovation to cash, and then how to avoid a lot of the traps that people fall into. And one of the biggest traps people fall into is they raise rather than lower the cost of customer thinking. So as you're going through this attempt to rationalize functional promises of impact, if you have one big promise that represents 70% of your value, why are you wasting time trying to rationalize 15 other features? Like, we've all seen it, the PowerPoint deck or the slides deck that goes on and on and on and on, as if those rationalizations are accretive, but they're not. They're actually they have a detrimental effect on the way a human can grasp and internalize this idea of internalizing through this emotional need to feel like if I exchange value, I'm going to feel that was a superior decision compared to all other decisions. So through the process of understanding the reality of value exchange and through some trial and error as an operator, ultimately what we come to grips with is that this idea of the total amount of value an offer possesses has no unit measure. So I sort of created one, and I said, well, look, gravity organizes the universe. And so why don't we think about business gravity as the force that organizes marketplaces? And if you deconstruct that force, you have an emotional component, a functional component, an economic component, and then ultimately value exchange doesn't occur until this worthiness component occurs. And you can think of like scores that would allow groups of people, entire organizations, to start to get on the same page about where deficits might occur. And, so what is the innate force created in nature that creates, in terms of a natural force, forms the basis of gravity? Well, it's mass. And so I use that as the parallel to say, if the innate value of the innovation is strong in and of itself before it's perceived by the marketplace, because it was really a super high quality innovation, that will have more mass compared to an innovation with less quality or less impact, which would have less mass, as perceived through the lens of these functional and emotional promises. And so it really became the only way I could think of as a way to communicate, not just, to sales and marketing people, but to engineering and product teams, about really the idea that if we are not being rewarded for the value of our innovation, like why doesn't a value exchange event occur? There's only 3 reasons ever. The first, the promise of impact wasn't sufficient. It probably means, in using the gravity metaphor, you just didn't have enough mass. I tell people the goal is to have mass out the ass. Okay, so if you don't, you cannot make a sufficient promise of impact. And there's this expression about certain offers or certain companies feeling like, we've heard the expression one trick pony. That's another way of saying the offer in and of itself did not have enough mass. The second reason value doesn't get exchanged is because maybe the promise is sufficient, but you simply can't keep your promise. Like, I've been with cybersecurity companies that could promise to make infrastructure unhackable. That's an amazing promise, but the technology to do it was undeliverable. Okay, so that's the second reason. And then the third reason is you have enough mass, you can keep the promise, but you don't have you're not adept at communicating the real value of your innovation. And that's what the framework solves. So the framework creates a blueprint for deconstructing any underperformance as Do we have enough mass to facilitate a value exchange event? Are we making the marketplace feel the way we want them to think? Is the marketplace perceiving it's worth it? And then ultimately, are we doing a good job of communicating this preponderance of value through the essence of our offer? And this is where clever marketing people can do miraculous things to put a very precise point on the essence of the preponderance of value in as short a term as possible, and as short a phrase as possible. I always admired CrowdStrike for their brand promise, which was CrowdStrike, we stop breaches, 3 words. And it made it abundantly clear what the promise of impact was. If you buy this product, you won't get breached. Now, they do many, many, many other things, but as soon as you start overcomplicating beyond the capacity to add more incremental gravity, then ultimately you're going backwards and not forwards. And that's one of the really, really prevalent traps that marketers fall into, is to think that in many instances more is more, but in actuality, the test I always use is, can you lower the cost of customer thinking to the point that taking anything else away would then not sufficiently create the strongest sense of worthiness possible? And it's a fine line. We have to strike a balance between saying too much and not enough. But if you stick with the framework will teach you how to construct messaging that maximizes, I sometimes call it the net gravity score. And that's I know it's a little bit of a long-winded way of describing it, but that's really the sets of ideas behind the gravity metaphor and its usefulness.
So do you start with taking this framework, do you start with the mission statement, or how do you start applying the framework into an existing organization that already have some successes, some failures, they have existing messaging, they have some messaging on the website, they have their marketing team, the product team, the C-suite, sales executives, and they may or may not always be exactly aligned behind one message. How do you go about and start to really put some order utilizing this blueprint and putting those pieces together? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've done both, right? So like actual almost blank sheet of paper, either because it was a pure startup or maybe a startup within a startup. We've all done a few of those. Or more commonly, it's a company who's been in market for many years. The good part is the principle doesn't change, whether you've been in market for many years or whether you're trying to enter the market now. I say often that the strategy, which in my terms is the altering of gravity, like the good news about these perceptions of functional, emotional, and economic value and this contemplation of worthiness, it's all hackable. It all exists inside the mind. Value is not real. Without humans on this planet, nothing would have value. It's a completely ephemeral concept. It only exists in the minds of humans. And once we understand that, we can equally understand that it's hackable then. We can influence the way people perceive it. So it really doesn't matter within my framework whether you've been in market a long time or a very short period of time, because ultimately the essence of the equation doesn't change. Let's find our uniqueness. That's where I start. And typically it's with founders and C-level teams, investors. Like, what was the investment thesis in the company in the first place? And what makes it unique? I was at a company called Zscaler, which was by far the most unique premise I'd ever seen in all of cybersecurity, the most unique promise of impact any company could make, because they had so much functional advantage. It's not to get too technical, but it's a technology that allows the entire internet to get wrapped with a fabric of security, and then a customer of Zscaler's internet traffic all flows through this fabric. But you can't delay the traffic. You have to log the traffic. You have to be able to report on the traffic, set policy on the traffic, scan the traffic, and do it in less than like 10 milliseconds. it's a technical feat of magic. It was so incredibly hard to solve those problems, but they solved them, and yet it still took some time. I mean, I don't dislike the term product market fit. I just don't love the term product market fit. Zscaler made a very bold promise. They had some service delivery problems in the beginning, and but once they were able to keep the promise, and sometimes these profound changes are driven by sort of macro innovations like cloud, and the next big macro innovation to drive a lot of change will be AI. Some general market acceptance of macro conditions that have pervasive and profound effects on entire marketplaces. Those take longer for the buyer to absorb. This idea of emotionally, can I absorb what the world moving to cloud will mean to me? Well, no, how could I? Like, it will take me years to really internalize what that might mean in the way I feel about that condition, or the way AI will make me feel. So, but ultimately, the market rewarded Zscaler for that functional uniqueness in massive, massive ways. So, to understand then how to make a promise of impact, you start with those teams, and the first thing you try to understand is, like, and I sometimes call it actually one of the executive teams I worked on called it the spider bite. Right? If you remember the scene from Spider-Man, he's in some radioactive chamber and the spider bites him, and the spider bite, provides this crazy superpower to occur. And suddenly there's something, now that's really special and unique here. So what is it? And pick, it doesn't matter if it's cybersecurity. Anytime you innovate, there is some equivalent of a spider bite that makes you investable, makes you worthy, allows you, and this is where these concepts are important, in the initial understanding of how to apply the framework is true to your purpose. Like, what were you trying to solve for in the first place? I was at a company called Malwarebytes, where a 14-year-old got his parents' PC infected. And, they didn't have a lot of money, and it was really a lot of peril that this 14-year-old was going to face if he couldn't do something about it. So he did what every 14-year-old does. He rode his bike to Best Buy. He bought Visual Basic for Dummies and wrote his own malware removal toolkit by learning to write code. And the community of white hats on the internet helped this young guy named Marcin, and it became the genesis of the company. Was born out of this story. That was his spider bite, and then this ability to remove malware really became, is one of the stories in the book, really became the essence of their perceived value. They were functionally better at that than anything else, and ultimately we started to build strategies around that idea that protection's great, but invariably we all have to accept that computer infections will occur, and so if you can't do anything about it, you're sort of left in this limbo. So arcing the brand around that promise of impact is what really moved the needle and helped sustain a big growth run for Malwarebytes. So always start there. Start with the genesis story of the company, understand how it feels to the founding team or to the executive team to be in that business. Like, what do they really aspire to? What promise do they want to make to the marketplace? Mission to me is like committed endeavor. Like, what's this thing that we're so willing to do? We're either going to achieve it or we're going to die trying. Mission can change. I typically think of mission as sort of a 3 to 5 year horizon. So once you start to understand that, it really sets the anchor point for these ideas of understanding, okay, now I understand what's unique. I understand what promise that bestows upon me. That's kind of my superpower, that bestowing of the capacity to make a unique promise of impact. That's true to the purpose of the company. And then you can start to ask simple questions like, and to whom do I make that promise? And that helps set the idea of like addressable market, and then over some period of time that you're trying to scope for, who's in scope for the promise, what's the size of the market, and you start to check the boxes one by one. Do I have an effective brand promise that unlocks the preponderance of my value, and to the point of the podcast, can help cut through the noise? Do I know who I'm making the promise to? It sets the idea of scope. And once you have that backdrop, you can then work on strategies to maximize your chance to reach the objective by the altering of gravity. Meaning, like, let's analyze and deconstruct the whole proposition. Do I have enough mass? Like the moon orbits the Earth because the Earth is bigger, but there's also an equation of distance. If the moon were further away, it wouldn't feel our gravity. And so this idea of getting closer, so two objects can feel each other's gravitational force, feels a lot like the vendor and the customer needing to get as close as necessary, so that there's that innate pull that creates access to the marketplace. So do I have enough mass? Have I achieved adequate proximity? We have to remember that you're not the only object in the business universe. So the gravity of alternatives has to be counted for. And you have to have countermanding forces, which I call anti-gravity. So weaken the emotional pull, the emotional appeal, the functional appeal, weaken the way a customer will contemplate whether another alternative is more or less worth it than your solution. And if you can do things to create anti-gravity against opposing alternatives, it's just as powerful as adding more mass or proximity. And trust me, adding mass and proximity is expensive and hard. Weakening the gravity of alternatives is a far less painful exercise, but companies don't do enough of it, but they should. And then occasionally there are these rare situations where you can have a non-linear reward system through things like a network effect, or through, to put it in kind of kind terms, through supply chain cooperation, but in some ways it's like supply chain manipulation. We all know that famously Microsoft dominated the supply chain by winning developers. And at some point, the developers took over, and Microsoft was getting more out of their innovation than they had to invest in terms of mass or proximity, because the super gravity effect sort of feeds itself. It's rare, but if your offer lends itself to a super gravity alternative, those are well described in the book as well.
So let's talk about execution, because you're talking about the shot callers and you're using the term kabuki dancers. Do you want to explain to the audience? Obviously, I understand what those terms are because I read the book, but do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit about execution? What does it mean to be a shot caller, and then the kabuki dancer term?
Well, I said, like, the question that gnawed at me, which sort of became the impetus to write the book, was, why is winning so rare? When it happens, they call you a unicorn. But there was another question, which is, because you hear this all the time. I mean, to turn on CNBC today, it won't matter. During some segment, someone will say some company failed to execute. And we've all heard that term hundreds or thousands of times, these failures to execute. And I thought, wow, I'm smart. My teams were smart. I mean, we did what we were supposed to do. Like, how are we not executing? And ultimately, it just led me to ask this question: are we failing to execute, or are we executing failure? It's like a bad golf swing. You can practice a lot with a bad golf swing, and you will incrementally improve up until a point, and then you will hit the wall. And then ingraining these bad habits is not a failure to execute. You're at the practice range. You're hitting golf ball after golf ball after, but you're not getting better. It's because you're executing on failure. And doesn't that sound kind of familiar for many of us when our company's growth slows down and we start hearing about how we have to, sort of squeeze more blood from the stone, and we have to run a tighter ship? And this is when all the metaphors and storytelling and locker room speeches kick in, and desire and energy, and where's your commitment and heart? I thought, I mean, give me a break. Like, I have all those things. That's not the problem. So in my analysis, especially when you use hindsight to look at, like, kind of a case study view of business success. You never hear about how these sort of gyrations, about giving the right speech or having the right culture, or, whether or not, you were paying for gym memberships. Like, it's never what's behind the story. What's behind the success is always the same thing. A company had a lot of mass and they knew how to unlock it, and they executed effectively on making the marketplace aware of the preponderance of the value of their innovation. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't drop balls or things didn't fall through the cracks, but ultimately there's no way around it. So, the term kabuki is straight out of this idea of what Japanese theater celebrates, called kabuki theater. And a lot of it is for affect. It's very ornate costumes and loud, sort of very affected movements and dialogue, all to over exaggerate the idea that this emotional state that people can work themselves into really has nothing to do with what happened. It's just sort of the trappings of life as it unfolds, and these sort of odd behaviors that people engage in because for some reason they think it matters. Like thousands of years ago, the Aztecs used to sacrifice a virgin when it got cold. And then, it got warm because they were in Central America, but sacrificing the virgin had nothing to do with it, did it? Right? So that became sort of this other gnawing sense as an operator of what we faced. What we felt we always had to overcome was these internal belief systems, which to me were never right. And then occasionally, we all get to work with some cool executives that seem to have it figured out and aren't really concerned with all of these trappings. And ultimately, we start caring about the ability to look forward and to understand what's the promise of impact, to understand the reality of the quality of the innovation that's driving our solution, to understand how to arc a brand under a shortcut to a promise of impact, and then really execute effectively. And this is, where I would say running the tight ship comes in. And then by being able to do those things, you get more high performing, you get more efficient, and you get more predictable. And ultimately, I feel like I could write a 3-year plan for pretty much any company. And once you remove all the superfluous sort of non-causal factors that I think in a lot of ways are still a part of a culture, just caring about things that don't matter. Once you're able to look past that and get to the heart of it and understand this innovation to cash process follows a framework. The market will reward you if you do it the right way at a certain level. And it's predictable, really imminently predictable. It's not even really that hard. And so ultimately, that's what I look for in terms of a company or an investment or people I want to work with, or people who can be a part of this deconstructive process to bring these questions down to kind of their foundational level, get the right answers, piece it together, come up with a really effective strategy that allows the organization to write its own blueprint for success. Altering mass is the same thing as our roadmap. Altering proximity is the same thing as our go-to-market plan. And if we have these other forces that we can leverage, we do that as well. And then we make projections that set the unit economic basis for the business that we shouldn't get ahead of. And I don't know, I read today, literally today, that quiet quitting is over. And now business is doing quiet cutting. It's no longer that, people have the luxury of quiet quitting. Like it's, the unit economics are broken at a lot of companies because of the stress of, largely coming out of COVID and like all the macro reasons that we know about. There's tremendous pressure right now on being able to not throw what ultimately, and you can say money, but it's just resource. When you apply resource ineffectively, you never get it back. And if it's not helping create an environment that conditions the marketplace to be receptive to a value exchange event, which you want to bring to scale, then ultimately that resource is gone permanently. It's just, you just poured gas on a fire that was never lit. So,
right.
So
So
yeah,
Tom,
that's bad.
Can you share, based on your experience or experiences, I should say, where this framework and blueprint was implemented? What were the outcomes? What was the change before and after? What was the impact by implementing this framework? How does that move the needle and allowed companies to cut through the noise and really get the right perceived value in order for a value exchange to take place?
Yeah, I'll give you some examples. A recent one was a company called Email Age in the anti-fraud space. I went there as the CRO in 2019 and or late 2018. So through 2019, the goal became to accelerate the growth rate for this company. They were looking for an exit, most likely through an acquisition, which occurred. The acquisition occurred at a 15 times multiple, which was double what other companies in that space had exited for. And what we were able to achieve is a cutting through the noise strategy that created a brand promise that encapsulated this preponderance of value idea. And we said, at Email Age, we can outsmart fraud together. Now, in those three words, the term outsmart basically meant we were referring to the AI and the custom algorithms that each customer would have tuned to their environment so that they could make the best possible decision about the risk associated with a fraudulent transaction. Referencing fraud made it really clear to understand outsmart fraud, like this is the problem we solve, so it was not ambiguous. And then together referred to the network effect. So in that company, customers had to share, like, if your Visa and American Express, if your technology can't make a fraud decision, it goes to what's called a manual review desk. And that's where the literal teams and teams of human beings have to sift through the details of a transaction and try to understand what really happened and then retrain the algorithm using that fraud outcome data. But if you're American Express, you only have your fraud outcome data. You don't have MasterCards or Discover cards. But at Email Age, as a part of the strategy, we required customers to share that fraud outcome data, which was 10 times more powerful than the normal AI adjustments, the adjustments made just through AI and machine learning. The manually solved problems were like gold, and we required customers to share that data. So an amazingly powerful promise of impact. So 10 of the 10 largest airlines, 5 of the 5 largest banks, 10 of the 10 largest credit card companies, 5 of the 5 largest ticketing agencies were all using the technology because they knew that together they were better. And so in 3 simple words, outsmart fraud together, we cut through the noise by creating a promise of impact that referenced the uniqueness of the offer. And so after kind of fixing the prior story, and like I don't care who gets the credit, working with a really strong team of product people and marketing people, coming up with this expression, indoctrinating the whole organization and what it meant through a very intensive sales enablement program. In just 2 quarters, we were able to triple the growth rate of the sales team. Now, we had added salespeople, but you could literally feel the difference in the capacity for the marketplace to become more and more receptive. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what this work should do, is make the marketplace more receptive to exchanging value with your organization. You could see it in the numbers, you could see it in the teams. And this was in all markets. We were in EMEA, Latin America, not so much in APAC, and obviously a big presence in the US. So that was a really good example. And there are others. It's just the framework in its formal state is somewhat new. So I don't want to act like there weren't teams of people that helped drive a lot of growth, like you at Trend Micro. Ultimately, Zscaler became a rocket ship. I was there early, but it was interesting to live through Zscaler's phase of value exchange and a little bit of falling into that trap of some service delivery challenges in the beginning. But when those were solved, the power of the innovation, the mass that innovation possessed, allowed the teams that ultimately carried the torch to just create a revolutionary value proposition in the cybersecurity marketplace. And then just recently at Human Security, where we sort of had a startup within a startup in a bit of a complicated situation with ultimately a merger. I saw the same thing. We had learned what was special about the approach that Human Security had taken, which was to turn the internet advertising industry into the world's largest bot sensor network. And we referred to that as our observability advantage. And then to be able to apply machine learning and to process this observable universe of data, which no one else in the world had. It created a very powerful pipeline for us. Now, ultimately, for other reasons that get complicated, we didn't move forward with the delivery of that roadmap because of a merger. But I have no doubt that we would have been tremendously successful if we would have added the mass we needed. And with that story, that cut through the noise. And again, I mean, that is really the key. That story that allows the brain to perceive high value and as shortcutted away as possible. That's where, and we sold like a few $1 million of the product in its early phase. If it had been a pure startup, that would have been talked about as one of the really hot, startups in tech. So I don't want to minimize it. I just don't want to. I don't want to piss anybody off.
So this is extremely powerful, cutting through the noise through a blueprint, through a framework, extremely powerful. When you start having these conversations, who do you start having this conversation with? Is it with the founding team? Is that with the CRO? Is that with the marketing? Where do you typically start having this type of conversations?
Yeah, I would say it's almost always the same. So it's, someone runs engineering, someone runs, I always say, look, there's a line between every business. There's the value creation half and the value extraction half. And you need the leadership, and whatever your structure is, it's not the same everywhere, but you need the leaders from the value creation half, and then you need the leaders from the value extraction half. But ultimately, the exercise is kind of fun to go through the exercise. This is one of the things, we're working on, is the formalization of the framework, so that teams can really, because you first have to understand some concepts that are not intuitive. I think in a lot of ways, that's why this is such a problem. Cutting through the noise is such a problem, is because it's not intuitive to spend a lot of time thinking about the genesis story of the company, the purpose, the mission, the uniqueness, aka the spider bite, and then how to create an effective brand promise, and then how to bulletproof the value proposition you intend to put in the marketplace, by communicating your essence of value really strongly and precise and crisp ways. Ultimately, I mean, most people experience your brand through your website, so you always have to collaborate with your marketing staff to get everyone on the same page. And then simply, sometimes it feels a bit incremental, the changes, because maybe you're already pretty close. Everyone I've ever worked with is really smart. So, it's not like any of this is ever entirely broken, and I think somewhere in the book I wrote the expression that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Largely what's in market, it's typically not horrible, but it's extremely dangerous to be off. And you know, the marketers use the expression about being off brand. Like you hear that expression a lot. It's extremely dangerous to be off brand because nature abhors a vacuum. If you're off brand, someone will notice that gap and come in with a really precise message that's completely on brand. There's one other idea too, that you know, innovation occurs not through the spectrum. I think a lot of people think about innovation as you know, only sort of disruptive functional innovation is the only innovation that gets rewarded. But there's another concept I encourage everyone to check out, a book called What Customers Want by Anthony Olwick, and to learn about a framework called Jobs to be Done as a framework. And it professes a pretty simple idea that solutions are tools to help customers get jobs done. And some jobs are functional in nature, some jobs are emotional in nature, in terms of their primary value type. But every job, in terms of whether someone will acquire a tool to help solve a problem, every job has to pass through the 3R test. The functional promises have to be rationalized, the emotions have to be reaffirmed, and ultimately this idea of the worthiness factor has to be accounted for. So all of those need to be in play across the teams that are going to be responsible for either what might be sort of, you know, like an email age. We didn't make a radical jump in the way we were communicating to the marketplace. I think really what we did was we honed in on the essence of uniqueness, and then we really honed in on a promise of impact that we could make seem imminently rational and really make customers feel the way we wanted them to feel. I remember we called it the video wall, and we had titles of customer logos with about, I don't know, there were at least a dozen video testimonials of other email H customers providing of basically a video reference for the solution. And it was extremely powerful because once you start rationalizing these functional promises of impact, you know, the question becomes, Alon, how do you feel? Well, I feel pretty good. Well, let me show you something. Maybe you're in the banking industry. Let me show you what the executive from this bank said about our solution. And that reinforcing of that idea that if I do this, I can feel good, that this will be the best decision for me and my company, is how ultimately this idea of your net gravity score going up. And it's not a perfect science. And it's always, I never, you know, act on my first impulse. So, you know, once you think you've nailed it in terms of promise of impact, what the brand should represent, the way to stay on brand, how to communicate the story so that the preponderance of value is easily unlocked. You know, there's always an iterative process. So, you know, it will be with executive teams and then the leaders of the value creation half, the value extraction half. But ultimately, I mean, this is what I mean. If you make mistakes along the way, and you don't get rewarded, it's not that you didn't execute. It's that at that point you executed failure. But if you get this right from that point forward, and this was my experience in all of these companies, is once you get this right, then execution can really happen. Because people can put their head down and just go do the work with the confidence to know that, hey, I'm maximizing the chance of success. In everything I say and do, I'm maximizing our chance for success. And then it's the job, like this is always the job of, and this is what to me separates the shot callers from the kabuki dancers, is the people with enough intellectual honesty to constantly evaluate, how are we doing? If we're doing well, can we do even better? If we have gaps, where are the gaps? And then like systematically, you know, deconstruct where the gaps are, but now you sort of have the blueprint to say, hey, look, do we have gaps in mass? Is there something that our offer lacks that's creating the inability for this functional promise to be kept or this emotional promise to be kept? Is the gap something we have to engineer our way out of, or is it something we have to communicate our way out of? And then get busy, and don't throw good money after bad. Fix the kind of, it's at that point, it's really about a root cause, as opposed to, I don't know. I mean, there's so much failed leadership in my view, that that creates a lot of tension and creates a lot of pain for people. We've all experienced it, and I think it's largely when people have no answers. Honestly, they're looking to blame someone, or they're looking, to say, hey, look, if we go down in flames, we won't say it was because of lack of effort, but lack of effort has nothing to do with it. You have to be a shot caller, or it's going to be hard.
Yeah, yeah. So that's great. So again, Tom, appreciate you taking the time today on this podcast. Exciting content, extremely valuable. If anyone wants to learn more about Call Your Shots, how they can cut through the noise, what's the best way to get in touch with you or to learn more about this topic?
LinkedIn is super easy, Thomas Miller, and you'll see an image with an image of the book cover, and so that's really easy. Email is my initials, Thomas James Miller, so TJM, the number 2, and TUP at Gmail. Shoot me an email or reach me on LinkedIn or reach Alon, and I mean, my own purpose was to democratize power. I think there are far too many wizards behind the curtain. Once you understand that you can apply a framework that is not that hard to learn, that maximizes the chance that a value exchange event can occur, if you're a part of helping a company achieve that, you're valuable, and that is not strictly the territory of the few, right? Just the C-level executives, and typically that's 5 or 10 people holding the fate of hundreds or thousands of people in their hands, and we're all waiting for the smoke to go up the chimney. And that's fine if they do it the right way. I certainly have no objection to it, but I just think everyone at a company should know how to be a shot caller, because honestly, it's not that hard if you know the science behind the innovation to cash process, and you have a framework for how to extract maximum value. I'm pretty sure everyone can do it. So that's the reason that I'm in this now at this point, is to help people and go further in their careers. And then a lot of pain gets created when these alleged failures to execute are really people being victimized because they're simply executing failure. And I think if we do it right in the first place, we can take a lot of the pain out of these endeavors and careers that we're all in the middle of. And the best thing is when you're succeeding and winning. I mean, nothing feels better. So if I can give that back, I'm happy to help.